Uh, so this is an interim report on JSTOR's experience hosting OA monographs, which we've been doing since October of last year. OA books in the humanities and social sciences, and when I say OA monographs, that's what I'm talking about this morning, go back to somewhere in the late 1990s. I'm not exactly sure where, but I know there were a few. But they were such a small number that they weren't. It was virtually unmeasurable until a couple of years ago. The last few years, we've seen several brave new initiatives: Knowledge Unlatched, the California Initiative Luminos, Amherst College Press, UCL Press. So that the number of OA monographs in the humanities and social sciences last year, I estimate, in English, was somewhere in the realm of 300 to 400 titles, which puts it in the realm of 1%, more or less, to 2% possibly, of total monograph output in English in the humanities and social sciences. It's a lovely thing, but it's still very small. And the big challenge, not too surprisingly, is funding. To quote that important philosopher from the 1960s, Janis Joplin, freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. And that is, in a sense, the problem with OA monographs. Nothing that's worth anything is cheap. Anything free is expensive. And to get OA monographs to any scale is going to require the entire scholarly community, publishers, libraries, scholars, so forth, to come up with something like $15 to $50 million a year, which is, of course, not going to be easy. That's going to be challenging. I could talk about that subject all morning, but that's actually not what I'm going to focus on. Let's focus on what we've learned so far at JSTOR with a few books. So we launched with 60 titles from 4 presses. We've since converted books that Knowledge Unlatched had made possible to be OA from a number of presses. So there's a list of the presses from which we have OA titles. We're shortly going to be making 1,200 titles from the RAND Corporation open on our platform. Another one of the many interesting things that we've learned so far about OA is not everybody thinks of OA in the same way. The RAND Corporation does not think of their books as OA, even though you can go to their website and download any book for free. But they will say, no, we are not an open access publisher. Nevertheless, they're going to allow us to do that, which is a great thing, and those books will then be available for scholars and readers without any toll or any impediments around the world. So since we've been collecting data since October, we've seen downloads or chapter views, which is to say somebody went to the trouble of opening up a chapter so they could read it online, in 218 countries and over 8,000 institutions around the world. So institutional uses that are identifiable by institutions account for about 60% of what we've seen so far, and then there's roughly 40% of the usage that is outside institutional ranges. It may still be people who are affiliated, we just don't know. This is the extent of the data that we have that we can analyze. Here are some of the numbers. We're basically creeping up on about 1 million chapter views or downloads of the books. And of course, remember, the number of books has been growing, so this data has to be taken with a little bit of a grain of salt. But what do we conclude? Well, these are really big numbers. There's a lot of use being made of these books on the JSTOR platform. Far more, I have to say, than we imagined was going to be the case. We entered this with an experimental mindset, and part of the experiment so far is we found, good grief, even for this relatively modest number of books, there seems to be a lot of people who want to look at them. The sources of the traffic. This actually accords pretty, and I don't know, all these things I'm going to tell you, I can't tell you entirely what they mean because we don't know. These sources of traffic are very similar to the sources of traffic generally for JSTOR. So what does that mean? I don't know. 40% of the traffic so far for the OA books have been people who started on JSTOR. So they opened up JSTOR. They could still be in an IP range, but they said, okay, I'm doing a search. Oh, look, here's something, click. Google and other search engines accounts for about 18%. That's actually less than we normally see. And then there's a big institutional OPAC, about 12%. That's also fairly common. And that's interesting because to date, only 227 libraries have bothered to download the MARC records for our OA books from OCLC. So I think a lot of that is the discovery services, but we don't entirely know. One of our presses, I thought it'd be interesting for you to see some of the data from one of our presses. This is data for the University of California Press, from whom we have 29 titles, and we've seen, just almost 120,000 uses of chapters from 187 countries, over 5,000 institutions to date. And just to narrow it down further to a single book, here's a book that was published in December, a Vietnamese Moses, and here is the usage to date. Just a few samples from countries: Vietnam, 111 uses, Germany, 68, Indonesia, 67, and so forth. So that brings me just to a few final things of what we've noticed. The usage is very much global, it's very worldwide. It's very thin. We don't see a lot of usage at any one institution. We'll see 10 or 8. But we see at a lot of institutions uses of these books. There's an apparent seasonal distribution to the usage, which also looks like usage on JSTOR, but which doesn't quite make sense to me, because the whole world doesn't go to university on the same schedule. So why these seasonal patterns are showing up there? We normally interpret them as, well, that's the height of the semester in the Northern Hemisphere, but that's not the case with the use of these books. So why is that the case? I have no idea. So that brings us basically to our next steps, where we're going to be adding more books, more presses. We're trying to build up more data. We're actually about to launch a project with Knowledge Latch Research and UCL Press and several of our other partner presses to analyze all this data in more depth, hoping to come up with just more answers about what we see in the data, but also trying to arrive at some baseline ideas about what analysis should be from any platform. Trying to figure out, so what is it we want to know about the use of these OA books so that we can determine their value for readers and scholars. And that's what I have. Thank you.